This video is my part 2 for the Animator Spotlight of both Sota Yamazaki and Takeya Niinuma. This will focus on their work from Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2, the two artists at their prime. But if you are interested in watching their origins and their growth over the years through their various other works, then you might want to check out the part 1 of this video. Anyway, right now, it's time for JJK Season 2. Again, it will never end. My channel is a Jujutsu Kaisen channel. That's it. Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, the second most requested video on my comment section ever. Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2, Episode 5. Yes, since the past week or so, it's only the second most requested now, because there's one guy who's made his mission to spam comments requesting for a Valiant Zang breakdown in every single comment, and I mean that in every single comment. Yes, I will make a Valiant Zang Animator Spotlight, but I need time for that. Alright, he's one of the greatest artists of our generation. I need to do some research, but it's coming. So please stop spamming. For Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 Episode 5, one look at the staff list and you will be able to tell that this is basically the same staff as Chainsaw Man Episode 8. For the core staff, we are missing Toto's supervision, and this time Goso is not directing the episode, he's taking the storyboards. But for the animation side of things, there is a lot of overlap. Takeya Niinuma handling A part of the visuals, Sota Yamazaki handling B part of the visuals. But this episode was a special project, even more so than Chainsaw Man Episode 8, which was produced during a production crash. This episode was the peak of the best planned segment of Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2, being the climax of the hidden inventory arc. While the production was already in shambles, it was not as awful as Chainsaw Man Episode 8. These allowed these two artists to, in a way, reclaim the identity of an animation director. For a while now in the industry, animation direction has been about completing layouts. The schedules are so tight and the junior artists in charge of the layouts are so inexperienced that animation directors are having to go through individual cuts of animation and do the completion work, which then has to be approved by the chief animation directors of that episode. But since the schedules are so tight and there are so many layouts to process, you end up needing multiple chief animation directors. Now you might be thinking, what is the point of the title of chief animation director if there are going to be multiple chief animation directors? Believe it or not, the role of the animation director is not just completion, it is also to direct the animation. It's a role that provides the opportunity for high-level artists to express their vision that they have for the character designs, which may or may not follow the character designer's own philosophies. The best example of this would be Kusuriya no Hitorigoto Episode 4. The character designs for the show focus on form. Thick, visible line art to accentuate form and express beauty. Episode 4 comes around and it's entirely different. The line work is extremely thin and delicate. There's little focus on form and more focus on looseness and movement. The illustrative and character design skills of Moang on a technical level surpasses that of the rest of the show. That is animation direction in its purest form, and it works best in character-driven works more than action works, even though it can work for action works. For example, Hakyugo does animation direction as well whenever he directs his own segments, and while his input with the designs is noticeable throughout the episode, it still shined more in Mob Psycho Season 3 Episode 8, which was far more of character-driven material. So now the canvas was ready. Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 Episode 5 comprised exclusively of character-focused material elevated by Gosto storyboards, and when it came to the drawings, full creative freedom given to the animation directors. And Niinuma and YamaSou made full use of the creative freedom provided to them because they basically redrew everything at every single stage. From the layouts to the Genga to the lip sync to the backgrounds, they drew and redrew every single element of every single scene to such a great extent that they were credited as assistant directors for the episode. And that's not just an honorary title that they received because they did so much work. If you look at Sota Yamazaki's production materials for the episode, you'll have a much more clear idea of what I'm talking about. The drawings made in cream colored borders, they are chief animation director sheets. This one is a little bit more complicated. The first image here is again a chief animation director sheet. Now these two look artistically very similar, even though one has a regular black border while the other one is in a chief animation director sheet. Similarly, there are these two images which also have black borders. These are corrections to short compositions that Sota Yamazaki made as the assistant director. Now the weird thing about this is that the background drawing shown in the chief animation director sheet did not even make it to the final episode. The final episode does have background animation, which is most likely again animated by Sota Yamazaki, but this particular image doesn't really show up. It does show up as a finalized background art, which means that what you're seeing here is not actually his correction as chief animation director, but just another one of his short composition corrections as the assistant director. So if this is a directorial correction and not an animation directorial correction, why is it in a chief animation director border, you may ask? And that's because it does not matter. He's redrawing every single element at every single stage that it doesn't even matter what sheet he's going to use. Now, if that was a little difficult to follow, I understand. This is a much more holistic approach to drawings than what you usually see with animation. Usually you have a layout artist, animation director making corrections, second key animator completing the Genga, animation director maybe making recorrections, and chief animation director finalizing the corrections. Somewhere in between, usually after the layout stage, the episode director can also make corrections to the shot composition, in which case the layout will have to be redone. What Soto Yamazaki is doing is removing all of the middlemen in the animation side of things as the chief animation director of this episode, and also removing the middlemen with the episode director side of things because he's also the assistant director. Takuya Niinuma's approach was also the same. It will be easier to see that from his work in episode 14, even though he's not credited as a chief animation director for either this or episode 14. In fact, Takuya Niinuma has never worked as a chief animation director. He's only ever worked as animation director. Does that mean Soto Yamazaki as chief animation director was also making corrections to Takuya Niinuma's segments? No. This is because the titles of animation directors can be quite vague. There's always meaning behind why they're credited as such, but it's always on a case-by-case basis. For episode 5 of Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2, the overall in charge of the drawings was in fact Soto Yamazaki as the chief animation director. But what he did as CAD was give full creative freedom to Takuya Niinuma for his segment. The reason Niinuma is not credited as CAD is because even though he is in charge of all the drawings in his segments, he is not overall in charge. That would be Soto Yamazaki. These two artists weren't the only ones who were animation directors for this episode. This episode had assistant animation directors, and the supervision of these artists was done by Soto Yamazaki because he was the chief animation director and not Takuya Niinuma. In addition to that, Soto Yamazaki also had assistants for the supervision of the animation directors from Sayaka Koiso herself, who was assistant chief animation director. And if any one of these assistant ADs did work on Niinuma's part, he may have even supervised them. But even then, he doesn't really care for the chief animation director title because he's credited as the assistant episode director anyway. It's a similar case with his participation in episode 14. This correction is credited to Shoichi, even though anyone should be able to tell at a glance that the shot was absolutely supervised by Takuya Niinuma. So why isn't he credited as animation director or chief animation director? Once again, because it does not matter, as he's directing the segment anyway. Ultimately, if you have the episode director credit, receiving other credits just depends upon random whims, I guess. Because there are some episode directors who are quite a bit hands-off with the animation, like Megumi Ishitani, who focuses much more on the directorial aspects, whereas there are others who are much more hands-on, like Sungo Park and Tatsuya Yoshihara, with the latter once again not caring about receiving any animator credit for it. Anyway, now let's get to the scene-by-scene breakdown of JJK. So this is the literal first cut of the episode. I'm not going to go through every single cut because I don't want to release a part 3 of this video as well. So I'm just going to focus on the cuts that I consider to be more important. And I do think the first cut here is very important. Now, for the average viewer, it doesn't really seem that crazy by any means, but for me what I'm looking at is how Niinuma is displaying the personality of the two characters on your screen right now just from their hands. So notice how the hands come up. Geto's hand has no inertia. It just comes up here and it stays there. It's very firm. Whereas now look at Shoko's arm. The hand has settle animation. By settle animation, I mean Geto's arm reaches its peak and it doesn't move. It immediately stops. Where Shoko's arm reaches its peak, goes back a little bit and goes front. And next for the throw itself, Shoko's arm has a wind-up. And for Geto, the wind-up exists, but it's way shorter. It's just one frame of wind-up. Geto is throwing the pencil like this, where Shoko is throwing the eraser like this. Shoko's much more playful with it, whereas Geto's arm is much more firm. Also, for the direction and writing side of things, it's kind of amazing how Shoko's throwing an eraser when her curse technique is about healing, which an eraser can metaphorically represent, and Geto is throwing the dangerous pencil. I could gush about this episode's writing and direction for one more video. I say one more because I've already done it once. Catch it over here if you wanna. So since I've done it already, I am gonna keep it minimal this time. The line count here is so minimal. The shading work is so minimal. Again, it's almost Kagenashi. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 shadow highlights, maybe his ear, so that's 5, and the volume is still so incredibly precise. Same with these drawings, the feature placement, it's so good, it's creepy. This is another drawing which looks so weird when put into the animated medium, but the volume is just so exceptionally precise. So the camera's focus here, it is a little bit warped, so the focus here is on its shoulder blades. That's the level where the camera is placed. So it has to wrap on top and wrap underneath. So the shirt is going down like this, which Gojo does have a natural V-taper. But over here, we saw that the shirt does go down straight. It doesn't go down on a V-taper. The V-taper here is due to the specific perspective of the shot. Same way the camera is wrapping around his head looks a little bit squished. If you think of it as just a two-dimensional drawing, it might even look awkward. And the reason might just be that something this complex just hasn't been done in Jujutsu Kaisen for character artwork. And that's just the illustrative side of things. When it comes to the animation, you see another two elements that I've talked so much about in part 1, and that's the weight distribution and the clothing animation. Look at how flawless that is. His arm comes up, so he naturally makes Gojo lean to one side. The changes in the folds of the clothing, I need to frame by frame that. His arm comes up, so obviously this part is gonna stretch. It's gonna reveal the anatomy of his back, and once it reaches its peak, it goes back down and the folds go back naturally. Looking at this scene, this is basically Daniel Kim's unfiltered animation. Niinuma didn't make any corrections to this, at least for the part that you'd focus on, which is the pencil flip and such. But in Daniel Kim's Genga, Gojo has long sleeves, so everything under the wrist, I'm assuming, was redrawn by Niinuma. Niinuma's shorthand designs really shine through here. Shorthand designs are very important for this specific shot as well, because you have to put Gojo as far as possible from Geto's perspective. Goso has storyboarded the scene specifically to show the growing distance between Geto and Gojo. This is the last chance Gojo had before Geto goes berserk. That's displayed through the writing of the storyboards, like there are steps over here. Gojo should have climbed these steps, come closer to Geto. I also love just how complex the shading is on his pants over here compared to the shorthand drawing that we saw earlier, which is this one that is basically Kagenashi. It has no shading whatsoever. This one is much more different, has a lot of emphasis on the shading on his pants because of course his pants are being stretched and pulled due to the weight of his palms. His hands are in his pockets here, and that is displayed through the shading of his pants. The shading here is of course exquisite, lots of spiky shading to display the stretching of the folds of the clothes. You see that again over here. Look at the way the clothes are stretching on these guys. Niinuma mobs have very unique facial features as well, like he draws the volume of the faces without actually defining the features. This works particularly well in this shot because it's all about dehumanizing them from Geto's perspective. These drawings have already been talked about enough. I'm gonna do it anyway. This is a shorthand drawing with 3 different levels of shading. Zoom in, it still has 3 different levels. That's the base layer over there. There's a darker shade to show the curvature of the shoulder blade, and an even darker shade to define the depth and volume of his musculature. No sharp strokes of shadows the way he draws clothes, much looser here to represent skin. Coming to the money shot now. I love the drawing itself, but the aesthetic that Niinuma has created through his drawings is even more impressive to me, especially the way he's drawn the water streaming down Geto's face here. The water is given a slightly darker color than his skin tone, but it also mixes with the natural depth in his eye sockets. You can't tell which is which. The extra white highlighting provided by the streaks of water, he's utilizing those to further emphasize the stress that Geto is going through right now. This is an insane flex even for his standards. Completely unique drawing in the sense that Niinuma designed this drawing to specifically work in this one case. He's never gonna use this style for his regular drawings because it wouldn't make sense out of this context. The use of dyed outlines are also exceptional in Niinuma's works. For example, these brown lines underneath his eyes. There are already a couple of black lines, which is the default outline color, but the extra brown lines combined with the pinkish color gradient defines his eye bags even more. Dyed outlines, by the way, you see it all the time in Niinuma's works. For example, Himeno's face here has incomplete outlines. Now getting to the Yuki drawing, I have prepared this stretch to break down this drawing and for no other reason. This is another drawing where you can clearly tell that this is Niinuma's raw drawing that we're able to see in the final product. The in-betweener did an incredible job of tracing Niinuma's lines to the dot. You can tell by the way the lines are drawn in her shoulder here, the biceps over here. All the shading work here to define the folds in her pants are particularly exceptional. The perspective on that hand, truly flawless. Looking at the midriff, that's a very tight top. I'm not complaining. Again, just look at the way her ear is drawn over here, or the way these two lines are intersecting. That has a tiny kind of imperfection in that gap. Those are the things that would get cleaned up by other departments, but don't, because these are Niinuma's raw unfiltered drawings that we are getting to see in the final version, which once again happens so rarely, even rarer in projects like Jujutsu Kaisen. Now, these two artists, specifically Niinuma and YamaSou, put in a lot of extra effort to make sure this happens. We will see that later on by looking at more of YamaSou's work. This entire conversation is just continuous animation director flex of everything that we've talked about Niinuma so far. This drawing is once again particularly impressive. The highlighting where the sun's hitting her they're just skipped. There's no outline over there. And the rest of the portions are defined by thick black outlines to create a very unique sense of contrast. And that shit is animated as well. When her fingers come up, it still follows that same line philosophy. Just look at how complete his artwork is over here. The shine on her nails are on the left side because the light source here is on the left side and the shading is adjusted accordingly. For the next drawing, the shine is on the right side because of the light source. Once again, we see dyed outlines here on her thumb, the nail. Coming to this Nanami drawing, God, again, the shading and the weight distribution is so precise. His arm being up here, so the clothes stretching in that direction, and it's sharp stretches. It's stretched to the max possible extent, right? His arm is all the way up. And while he brings his arm down, the energy of the stretch, it dissipates. It becomes more blob-like. The shading shifts accordingly. His arm comes down. So all this portion that was stretched this entire time, it is now loose. So it's folding outwards, which is again defined through the shading. This is all an illusion. It is all showcased through drawings. These guys are magicians. Before I even get to the bloody hand, just look at how his regular hand looks. Draw his hands in the loosest way possible, in the most powerless way possible. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that he did the painting for this hand as well. Regardless, I would love to see the Genka for this, and this is probably the best correction in the episode. Tied with the Geto in the shower scene, I count 4 different layers, which is standard for the highest level of shading. It usually never goes past 4, but what makes this so impressive is the granularity of it, just in how many different instances those 4 levels are used. This portion here, for example, the multiple irregular shapes that he's created using the lightest shade is just exquisite. Here Niinuma is using small strokes of lines to display injury or dirt on the faces of these girls. It's not small line art to define depth like the way Tanaka does it. It's extra components on top of their faces. Here's another quality of modern animation directors. When there's incredibly creative animation on display, you just let it be. This is Hisashi Mori's animation. It is completely uncorrected by Takeo Niinuma. This is as raw as Hisashi Mori's artwork can get, and it's translated from his paper to our screen flawlessly. The same was done for Chainsaw Man episode 8. The animation director in charge of Hisashi Mori's segment was Soto Yamazaki, but he did not make any changes or corrections to Hisashi Mori's artwork. When you let specialized styles like this one just be, the juxtaposition of that causes massive impact. This is an incredibly memorable scene. Switching to Soto Yamazaki's segment, here he's fully fleshing out his unique style. And apparently he's into this minimalist flat style, which if you've been following me for a while, you know I love. It's sort of like an in-between of Takeo Niinuma and Hakyugo style of art, sort of similar to Nakaya Onsen's in that way as well. So this is Soto Yamazaki, idiosyncratic to a level that might scare away the casuals, but you get the opposite reaction from Sakuga-tards like me. From this first drawing, Gojo's hair is completely comprised of dyed outlines, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, including the hair at the back of his neck. Area that is highlighted still does have black outlines, so it's not like Niinuma in that regard. Niinuma probably would have skipped these outlines as well. Again, the volume on Yaga's face is just so brilliant. He's kept in the shadows here, so he has to use a lot more line art to define the depth, and every single line here is so important. These lines to define the structure of his nose, these to define the cheeks, these to define the crevice over here that middle-aged men have. I don't know what to call it. The acting here is so incredible as well. Again, look at the trembling hand and look at how jittery the line art is over here. That kind of nuance would be lost with bad in-betweening and such. Look at the detail on that cigarette bird. Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. That's gorgeous effects animation. All the characters in the mobs, none of them have outlines or the traditional outlines. They all have dyed outlines. The only standard outlines that we see here, the black ones, are on Geto. It's a little bit on the nose with the storytelling on how he's walking in the opposite direction to the crowd, but it visually stands out as well. All the characters in the mob having dyed outlines and washed out colors, whereas Geto naturally pops out. This is the signature Soto Yamazaki pose. I call it the return to monkey pose. He loves drawing people with wide shoulders and with this specific angle of legs. It's an extremely loose way of drawing characters, and there are people who won't appreciate it, but from a technical standpoint, it is undeniably amazing. He's using shading here again, his signature blob-like shading to define depth, and look at the detail in the eyes as well. So gorgeous. Niinuma's designs for this episode were already quite a bit loose, but YamaSou is taking that to the next level. More of the return to monkey pose. I love Gojo's left hand here as well. The volume is so precise. It's this, right? That's what he's doing, but no tertiary shadows or anything. It's just 2 layers of colors, and it's gotten across by the fundamental skill of line placement. The line art here is, again, is so impressive. The portion where his thumb is joining the wrist here, You see it cutting into the wrist and here as well. Those are imperfections that are lost when animation is traced through in-betweening. This is what look back is going to look like, by the way. An even more refined version of this, and for the duration of a whole movie. So I'm very excited for it. It's going to be cinema in the most literal way possible. Again, look at the jitteriness in the line art. This is again such a flawless illustration. I love it. The way he's distributed Gojo's weight here. Once again, minimal details, minimal shadows, and he still achieved such an appealing drawing. I love the acting on this kid here as well. So she's straining her little tiny feet here to look over the stage and see what's up. And then she loses her balance and comes thudding down. It's so cute. It's so beautifully animated. The head pats as well. Yeah, those are S-tier head pats. Coming to the highlight of this episode, and one of the greatest highlights in Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2. This is one of my favorite sequences of animation ever. The animator itself is unknown, but again, So Yamazaki redrew the scene at every single stage to such a great extent that it's basically entirely his work. YamaSou did do the layout of the head pat segment. He didn't post the layout for this scene, but in the chief animation director sheet, you can see that he basically did a complete redo of the scene anyway, and that's only a redo if the layout wasn't his already. The subtlety with the character acting, extremely simple shapes again. The aesthetic here is also brilliant. Geto's skin color is basically white. It looks like he's wearing kabuki makeup and he's on stage performing. Look at the way the fingers wrap around his face. Oh, it's so good. The highlight is the dip that he does here. Yeah, gotta go frame by frame for that. It's so much more looser here. There's so much more flow to it. It is exactly like a performance. It also signifies Geto's freedom. No more rigid movements. Here, once again, just look at that fucking shorthand drawing. It's so good. He looks like a fucking gang member, the way he's holding his neck here. The mic has so much goddamn detail. It's completely lineless, and well, enough has been said about that cut. Looking at the production material of this, you can also kind of see how YamaSou goes about just constructing the human face. This is not as simple as a circle with an X mark. He's first outlined the entire area of the face that has three-dimensional depth, and then he's defined the individual features. Looking at Takeo Niinuma's production materials, you will see just how similar both of their approaches are. This Mei illustration in particular is my favorite. All of her voluptuousness underneath the clothing is already defined. And that's it. That's the whole vid. These two videos linked two artists together to showcase how YamaSou's progression was linked to Takeo Niinuma's progression and how they've both evolved as artists, ending with the finale being Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 Episode 5. These two now have well-established styles to the way they draw characters. Until YamaSou did this, and then did this, and then this, and then this. I guess I have to talk about that. But before I get to that, let's go to episode 14 and look at Takeo Niinuma's first time as a director. Saying first time is not exactly accurate because he was the assistant director for his portion of JJK episode 5, as I mentioned. But these are also his storyboards. So this entire segment is fully Takeo Niinuma's vision. And I'm assuming he got on this immediately after his work in episode 5. He did not split his works like YamaSou did for all the episodes, and after this he was done. He joined, I'm assuming, Chainsaw Man's production. So immediately the shading on this crow is so exceptional. The color design does not really allow it to stand out much, but it's incredible regardless. The storyboards here are incredibly Goso-esque, which is only normal considering how many times he's worked with Goso storyboards. This is the highlight animated by Takeo Niinuma over here. Again, the same philosophy that he uses for facial construction. It's very similar to the way YamaSou draws, as I've already shown, but the way he's given 3 layers of shading. Is it 3? 1, 2, 3. It is 3 layers of shading to the mobs. There's one base color, one darker color for depth, and one highlighting. It is genuinely exceptional. The best part is that every one of these move. The hand here is just so incredibly well drawn. The granularity again is so gorgeous. The volume on Mei's face here, again with 3 different layers of shading. The shading here is just exquisite as usual, but the in-betweening work here is far more rushed. It's more noticeable compared to episode 5. The storyboards though are just flawless. Look at that. It's established that Uyui is about to die here. He doesn't, but that's what the viewer thinks. So the next shot, you have the feathers from Mei's crows hiding Uyui's face. So this was not entirely corrected by Takeo Niinuma, by the way. This portion was corrected by Toto's Kazutaka Sugiyama, who made time, regardless of how busy he is with Chainsaw Man, to help with this project because episode 14 was incredibly critical. And then we get back to the highlight philosophy that I was talking about with Takeo Niinuma. It's animated by Rui, completely left up to Rui to decide what the drawings will look like, once again to create that impactful juxtaposition. I'm assuming we'll see that in Chainsaw Man as well, if he gets to direct in Chainsaw Man, that is. The storyboarding done here, extremely deliberate the way the shot flows, all facilitated through Shoichi's incredible animation direction. She turns around, the camera tracking is perfect. She turns back around, and there's the face. There's an extraordinary level of detail over here. This is a drawing by Shoichi. This entire segment is corrected by Shoichi. However, I'm assuming heavy supervision by Takio Niinuma. This is once again clearly a Takio Niinuma drawing. Actually, it feels more refined, so I'm assuming it could be Shoichi. God, these artists are continuously popping up with the same level of talent as like a decade-old industry veteran. They just started animating a couple of years back. This is once again Shoichi's corrections. It's unknown who the key animator is. It's really fluid. It's gorgeous. It doesn't look like there's much Niinuma input there. However, this is directly a Niinuma drawing. Overall, this is one of the best directed sequences in the whole show. It's so goddamn good. I would say it's at least like top 3 in the show in terms of direction. So that's the end of Niinuma's work for Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 and this video as well. I'm very excited to see his work on Look Back as well, though that's more like a Kiyotaka Oshiyama solo project. I don't think I have eyes advanced enough to tell apart Niinuma's work from Oshiyama's work. Anyway, looking forward to whatever Niinuma works on next. Leaks floating around on how he'll have a pretty major role for Chainsaw Man. Hopefully that's true. And now let's get back to YamaSou. Now, what is a good drawing? So different people have different ideas of what good art is. If something is of a very high level of art, regardless of your subjective taste, it is still very high level of art. Now, what is your subjective taste in character designs or art? Do you think it's art that follows the character design sheet? Art that focuses on following, but also enhancing the character designs through the artist's own idiosyncrasies. A flat, loose art style that focuses on expressiveness. An even flatter, but sharper style, maybe like a hyper-exaggerated style with lots of volume that evokes deep emotion. Maybe you like an exaggerated flat style that evokes the same level of emotion. Or maybe you're just looking for good old manga accuracy. What if an artist can do all of these? Now, none of these styles are objectively superior to another. It just depends on the context, I would say. It could be superior to another in terms of execution, but since these are all done by the same artists, the execution is equally flawless in each case. If you're talking about only versatility, through one project, that is Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 alone, Sota Yamazaki has demonstrated that he's the best animation director in the industry. If as the director you want an artist to just showcase his incredible style, you get Sota Yamazaki. If you are a director who has a specific vision and want a high-level animation director to follow through with that vision, you get Sota Yamazaki. If you're a director and want an artist to draw the highlight of your episodes, you get Sota Yamazaki. Finally, if you're just a director who's struggling to get work done because the production time is so short, you get Sota Yamazaki. He was chief animation director for 7 episodes, animation director for 2 episodes, assistant chief animation director for 2 episodes. He did animation assistance for episode 9, which is basically just more animation direction work without being credited as such for some reason. And he also somehow did second key animation for episode 5 and 23. He also was the chief animation director for episode 17 of Jujutsu Kaisen. You can see his works in the CAD sheets, but he was only credited as animation director because Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2. That was, of course, not all of the work he did for some of the more important cuts like Yuki's ass or Yuki's side boob from 4 different levels of depth. He did the doga as well. And that makes a difference. The most impactful artwork from episode 18 was when Haibara walks up to Nanami. And the only reason the artwork was so goddamn organic in the final product was once again because Sota Yamazaki just did the doga and he goddamn colored it while he was at it. There's nothing quite like his manga accurate designs either. He had the highest level of understanding of Akutami Gei's art from anyone in the production. The only one who even comes close is Soti, who animated the Stand Proud You're Strong segment. But yeah, Sota Yamazaki's manga designs are fucking exquisite. Sota Yamazaki was the savior of Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2's production, as much as he was for Chainsaw Man. For Chainsaw Man, he was the chief animation director for 4 of the last 5 episodes. For Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2, he did the same. He's chief animation director for the last 4 episodes in a row. And the quality of his artwork never dropped. Animators were completing the layouts in a matter of days, and he was still pumping out artwork of this quality. Look at the volume definition in all of those individual ice crystals, and the shading of the frost on Yuji's back, and the incredibly complex perspective that he's drawing over here. Apart from this, all the important highlights in all these episodes were also supervised by him, like the Shizo Todo sequence from episode 21 or the Shizo Todo sequence from episode 20, both done by him. This is what the animator is leaving him with, and while it is incredible animation, it is obviously not representative of the final product. The way YamaSou is making these corrections are still similar to his philosophies in Chainsaw Man. He is not just sticking to correcting faces, he's correcting movements as a whole. Out of all of his works for JJK Season 2, the most technically impressive corrections in terms of detail would be his work from episode 9 and of course episode 12. The styles of his corrections in both of these episodes are quite similar. He's flexing with the sheer amount of volume that he's able to get across through his shading, and of course these shadows are not randomly thrown on the characters' faces. Every single line that defines the shadows is deliberately placed. You can also see how he uses the shadows to get the illusion of depth across. For Gojo, more portions of his clothes have the darker shade than the base color, whereas for Nanami, more of the portion has the base color. Now of course the source of light does come into play, but generally this is how he's drawn the two characters, because for Gojo his clothes are a lot more loose, and because of that there are a lot more folds in his clothes, and those folds are depicted using the darker shade. Whereas for Nanami, his shirt is a lot more tight because he was buff as fuck in this episode for some reason. As a result of that, his shirt has lesser number of folds and thus less of the darker shade. The darker shade is used more in this case to showcase his muscle anatomy more than anything. I also love these next couple of drawings. This one because Sukuna just looks super handsome here, honestly. We don't really get to see this in the final version because of the cinemascope, and it's the same case with this Todo correction over here. It looks fucking exquisite. Once again, due to the constraints of the shot, we couldn't really see what's outside the camera in the final version, but I'm glad that Sota Yamazaki did release the drawings for us to see. I have a very close attachment to these artists because with Chainsaw Man and Jujutsu Kaisen, it feels like you've been there since the start of the growth of these artists. You saw them develop their styles, yes, and you saw them peak, and you were able to follow them from the start of their career. Gosso, Takio Niinuma, and Sota Yamazaki, they had their entire lives ahead of them to continue to evolve and create incredible art. And I have my entire life ahead of me to follow them. It is a sort of parasocial relationship that, it's unhealthy, but I enjoy regardless. I'm lucky to be born in the right generation. And I'm sure people like me of every generation have said that because of artists in their own respective generations like Takio Niinuma and Sota Yamazaki. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, leave a like. If you did not like this video, leave a dislike. Subscribe and share, spread the love. And that's about it. Thanks for the views.